I am witnessing the construction of a new global order emerging from the crucible of three simultaneous crises reshaping international power. Ukraine burns in its third year of conflict, Taiwan sits beneath the shadow of inevitable confrontation, and Syria has collapsed into a post-Assad void, shattering decades of regional alignment. These are not isolated events. They are foundational pillars upon which tomorrow's bipolar world is being built. What I observe unfolding across these theaters is the death throes of the multipolar moment and birth of a new Cold War structure defining the next half-century. The illusion that great powers could coexist within a single rules-based system is disintegrating, replaced by harsh reality. NATO and democratic allies on one side, the Russia-China-Iran axis on the other. The question is no longer whether this bifurcation will occur, but how violently it will crystallize. I have analyzed the gradual erosion of American hegemony and rise of challenger powers, but what strikes me now is the acceleration. These three crises are stress tests, forcing every major power to choose sides, abandon strategic ambiguity, and commit to incompatible visions of world order. There is no middle ground left. The luxury of strategic autonomy is evaporating in real time. In Ukraine, I see the blueprint for this architecture taking shape. What began as territorial conflict has evolved into comprehensive testing of Western resolve versus Eastern persistence. Russia transformed this war into an existential challenge to NATO's credibility, while the United States treats Ukrainian success as essential to maintaining liberal international order. Neither side can afford to lose without catastrophic damage to global standing, meaning both are committed to escalation rather than compromise. But Ukraine is only one leg of a three-legged structure. Taiwan represents the potential spark that could ignite the Pacific theater, while Syria has become the unexpected catalyst that has already begun reshaping Middle Eastern alignments. Each crisis reinforces the others, creating a self-reinforcing cycle of polarization that makes neutral positioning increasingly impossible. I observe nations across the globe being forced to calculate not just their immediate interests, but their long-term survival within one of these emerging blocs. The speed of this transformation is breathtaking. Just 18 months ago, European leaders still spoke of maintaining economic relationships with China while strengthening security ties with the United States. Today, that balancing act has become untenable. Chinese support for Russia's war effort, combined with Beijing's increasingly aggressive posture toward Taiwan, has forced European capitals to acknowledge that economic interdependence with authoritarian powers is a strategic liability, not an asset. Similarly, I witness global South countries discovering their traditional non-alignment is becoming obsolete. The Russia-China-Iran bloc offers alternative financial systems, energy partnerships, and security arrangements challenging Western hegemony. Nations must choose between dollar-based systems and yuan-ruble alternatives, between Western technology and Chinese infrastructure. The middle path is disappearing. This bifurcation process is accelerating because each crisis feeds the others. Russia's dependence on Chinese economic support deepens Beijing's commitment to Moscow's survival. Iran's isolation from Western markets pushes Tehran closer to both Russian energy cooperation and Chinese investment. Meanwhile, Western sanctions and military aid create mirror dependencies that lock democratic nations into increasingly rigid alliance structures. Every escalation in one theater reverberates across the others, tightening the bonds within each bloc while widening the chasm between them. What makes this emerging Cold War different from its predecessor is its economic foundation. The original Cold War was primarily ideological and military, with limited economic integration. Today's conflict unfolds within a deeply interconnected global economy that both sides actively weaponize. Trade flows, financial systems, technology transfers, and supply chains have all become instruments of geopolitical competition. I observe this decoupling accelerating across multiple dimensions. Technology sectors split into incompatible ecosystems as the United States restricts semiconductor exports to China while Beijing develops indigenous alternatives. Energy markets fragment as Europe abandons Russian supplies while Moscow redirects flows to Asian customers. Financial systems diverge as Western institutions exclude Russian and Iranian entities while China develops alternative payment mechanisms. The implications of this transformation extend far beyond the immediate participants in these conflicts. Countries that have built their development strategies around access to global markets and supply chains now face the prospect of choosing between economic integration with one bloc or the other. The era of benefiting from relationships with all major powers simultaneously is ending. Nations must now calculate which bloc offers better long-term prospects for security, prosperity, and technological advancement. This calculation is particularly acute for middle powers that have traditionally played balancing roles in international politics. Countries like India, Brazil, Turkey, and South Korea find themselves under increasing pressure to abandon strategic ambiguity and commit to one camp or the other. Their decisions will largely determine whether the emerging bipolar structure becomes a stable balance or an unstable confrontation prone to miscalculation and conflict. I analyze these developments through the lens of historical precedent, and what I find is both illuminating and disturbing. The transition from multipolar to bipolar systems has historically been accompanied by significant instability and conflict. The emergence of the original Cold War required 2 world wars and decades of adjustment before stabilizing into a predictable pattern of competition. Today's transition is occurring within a more complex global system with nuclear weapons, economic interdependence, and multiple theaters of competition, creating new possibilities for miscalculation and escalation. The nuclear dimension adds particularly dangerous elements to this emerging structure. Unlike the original Cold War involving 2 nuclear superpowers with clear command structures, today's emerging blocs include multiple nuclear states with varying sophistication and control. Russia threatens tactical nuclear use in Ukraine. China expands its nuclear arsenal facing potential Taiwan conflict, and Iran approaches nuclear capability while operating through proxy networks. This multiplicity increases the probability that local conflicts could escalate beyond regional containment. But perhaps most concerning is the absence of effective crisis management mechanisms between emerging blocs. The original Cold War developed over decades, allowing gradual establishment of communication channels and arms control regimes. Today's transition happens at lightning speed with limited institutional frameworks for managing escalation. The result is more volatile confrontation lacking stabilizing mechanisms that prevented the original Cold War from turning hot. I observe this institutional deficit most clearly in the economic sphere, where the absence of agreed rules for economic warfare has led to an escalating cycle of sanctions, counter-sanctions, and retaliatory measures. Unlike military competition, which is governed by established deterrence theories and crisis management protocols, economic warfare lacks comparable frameworks for preventing escalation. Each side responds to economic pressure with increasingly aggressive measures, creating a spiral of economic decoupling that neither side seems able to control. The technological dimension of this competition presents similar challenges. The race for dominance in artificial intelligence, quantum computing, biotechnology, and space capabilities is proceeding without the arms control agreements that managed military competition during the original Cold War. The dual-use nature of these technologies means that advances in civilian applications directly translate into military advantages, creating incentives for secretive development and preemptive action that increase the risk of technological surprise and strategic instability. As I examine the current trajectory of these 3 crises, several scenarios emerge for how this new architecture might solidify. The most optimistic possibility is a managed competition similar to the original Cold War, where clear spheres of influence emerge and both sides develop institutional mechanisms for preventing escalation. This would require recognition by all parties that uncontrolled competition serves no one's interests, and that some form of strategic stability is preferable to permanent crisis. A more concerning scenario involves the crystallization of this bipolar structure through a major conflict that forces all uncommitted nations to choose sides definitively. Such a conflict could emerge from escalation in any of the three current theaters, but Taiwan represents the most likely spark, given the fundamental incompatibility of Chinese and American positions regarding the island's status. A Sino-American war over Taiwan would immediately globalize the conflict and force every nation to choose between supporting democratic allies or authoritarian challengers. The most dangerous scenario is the emergence of a tripolar system where the current China-Russia partnership fractures under the pressure of their differing interests, creating three competing blocs rather than two. This would recreate the inherent instability of multipolar systems while maintaining the intensity of great power competition. Historical experience suggests that tripolar systems are particularly prone to shifting alliances, miscalculation, and conflict as each power seeks to prevent the other two from forming a dominant coalition. What seems increasingly clear is that the current phase of transition cannot continue indefinitely. The economic costs of maintaining parallel systems, the military risks of uncontrolled competition, and the diplomatic strain of permanent crisis are forcing all parties towards some form of resolution. The question is whether this resolution will emerge through negotiated accommodation or through the trial by fire of major conflict. I believe we are approaching a critical juncture where the fundamental parameters of this new order will be established. The outcomes in Ukraine, the resolution of tensions around Taiwan, and the stabilization of post-Assad Syria will largely determine whether the emerging bipolar structure takes a confrontational or competitive form. If current trends continue, I expect the next 18 to 24 months will witness the crystallization of this new architecture into a relatively stable configuration that will define international politics for decades to come. Yet even as this bipolar architecture solidifies, I observe a critical vulnerability that neither bloc fully comprehends: the growing instability within their own internal structures. The Western alliance faces unprecedented stress as European economies struggle with energy costs, American domestic politics become increasingly unpredictable, and democratic societies question the sustainability of prolonged confrontation. Meanwhile, the authoritarian bloc suffers from fundamental contradictions between Chinese global ambitions, Russian imperial nostalgia, and Iranian revolutionary ideology that may prove impossible to reconcile over the long term. This internal fragility creates opportunities for strategic disruption, moments when apparent stability shatters through internal contradictions or external shocks. Assad's collapse provides perfect example. Syria was central to Iran's regional strategy and Russia's Middle Eastern presence, yet both proved unable to prevent sudden collapse when attention and resources were stretched thin elsewhere. I anticipate similar vulnerabilities will emerge within both blocs as the costs of maintaining global confrontation accumulate. Economic pressures, domestic political changes, and strategic overstretch will create fissures that could fundamentally alter the trajectory of this new Cold War. The side that better manages these internal contradictions while exploiting the weaknesses of its opponent will ultimately determine whether this emerging architecture stabilizes into a manageable competition or explodes into something far more destructive. The Global South represents the wild card in this emerging structure. Unlike during the original Cold War, when most developing nations were either colonized or newly independent with limited agency, today's Global South contains economic powerhouses, technological innovators, and regional hegemonies that cannot simply be treated as passive participants in great power competition. Countries like India, Indonesia, Brazil, Nigeria, and Saudi Arabia possess the capacity to shape outcomes rather than merely react to decisions made in Washington, Moscow, or Beijing. I observe these nations developing sophisticated strategies for navigating bipolar pressures while maintaining autonomy. Many pursue tactical alignment, supporting specific initiatives from each bloc while avoiding comprehensive commitment. This allows extracting concessions from both sides while preserving flexibility for future realignments. However, this tactical approach has inherent limitations becoming apparent as competition intensifies. Modern development increasingly demands deep integration with specific supply chains, financial systems, and innovation networks. As these diverge along bloc lines, the cost of maintaining relationships with both sides will rise exponentially. The speed of this forcing function will depend largely on how quickly the two blocs develop parallel institutions and systems. If the process unfolds gradually, Global South nations may have time to build alternative arrangements that preserve some autonomy. If it accelerates rapidly, particularly through crisis escalation, these nations may find themselves compelled to choose sides under circumstances that offer little room for negotiation or nuance. What makes this transformation particularly profound is its technological dimension. Unlike previous great power competitions focused on military capability and territorial control, today's bipolar structure is built around control of technological systems defining the next century. Artificial intelligence, quantum computing, biotechnology, space technology, and renewable energy systems are becoming competition theaters where cooperation between blocs is increasingly impossible. I analyze this technological competition as fundamentally different from military rivalry because it operates according to network effects and winner-take-all dynamics. In traditional military competition, rough parity can create stable deterrence. In technological competition, small initial advantages compound rapidly into decisive superiority that may lock in permanent advantages. This creates enormous pressure for preemptive action and aggressive competition difficult to control. Neither side can afford falling behind in critical technologies, but intensity necessary to maintain parity risks triggering conflicts neither actually wants. The race for technological supremacy may become a classic security dilemma where defensive measures appear offensive, leading to escalation, serving no one's real interests. The implications extend far beyond military applications. Control of key technologies determines economic competitiveness, social organization, and cultural influence. The bloc-dominating artificial intelligence will shape how future societies organize information. The bloc-controlling biotechnology will determine humanity's approach to health and environmental challenges. I observe both blocs investing enormous resources in achieving technological independence from each other while maintaining superiority over potential competitors. This drive for technological autarky is creating massive inefficiencies and duplicated efforts that slow global innovation while accelerating political tension. The result is a world moving toward technological apartheid, where different populations live within incompatible technological ecosystems that make cooperation increasingly impossible. Perhaps most concerningly, I witness emergence of civilization-level competition, where blocs compete not merely for political influence or economic advantage, but for the right to define humanity's future trajectory. The Western Bloc promotes individual rights, democratic governance, and market-based innovation. The Eastern Bloc advocates collective security, technocratic efficiency, and state-directed development. These represent fundamentally incompatible visions of human organization that cannot coexist indefinitely within a single global system. This civilizational dimension of the competition makes compromise and accommodation far more difficult than during the original Cold War, when both sides at least shared basic assumptions about industrial development and state sovereignty. Today's competition involves different concepts of legitimacy, different models of technological development, and different visions of humanity's future that leave little room for the kind of peaceful coexistence that eventually characterized U.S.-Soviet relations. The nations and leaders who understand this transformation and position themselves accordingly will be the ones who shape the emerging order. Those who continue to operate under outdated assumptions about multipolar flexibility and strategic autonomy will find themselves marginalized in a world that no longer tolerates such ambiguity. The new Cold War architecture is not a distant possibility. It is the emerging reality of contemporary international politics, and its foundations are being laid in the rubble of Ukraine, the tensions around Taiwan, and the chaos of post-Assad Syria. The question that will define the next generation is not whether this transformation will occur, but whether humanity can navigate it without destroying the very civilization both blocs claim to protect.